The evening sun cast long shadows across Atlanta's busy streets as Sarah Johnson drove her Honda Civic through downtown. After 12 hours of intense training, her muscles ached, but a small smile played on her lips. The practice had gone well, and she felt ready for next month's competition. The car's dashboard clock showed 7:45 p.m. Sarah had promised to call her mother before dinner, and she was looking forward to a hot shower and a quiet meal. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes were far from her mind as she hummed along to the soft music playing on her radio. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. This wasn't her first time being pulled over, and she knew exactly what to do. She signaled and carefully pulled her car to the side of the road, positioning it well away from the traffic. Her hands stayed visible on the steering wheel as she waited. Officer Mike Peterson approached the driver's side window, his flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. Sarah noticed his stern expression before anything else. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with a clean-shaven face and perfectly pressed uniform. "License and registration," he demanded, not bothering with a greeting. Sarah kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents. "Of course, officer," she replied politely, her voice steady despite her growing unease. The certificate proving she won 3 Olympic medals sat in her wallet behind her license, but she didn't mention it. Experience had taught her that staying quiet was often the safest choice. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Peterson's tone was sharp, his flashlight beam still aimed at her face. Sarah squinted against the light. "No, sir, I don't." "You ran a yellow light back there. It was about to turn red." He paused, studying her face. "Where are you coming from in such a hurry?" Sarah's training clothes and gym bag sat in plain view on the passenger seat. "I'm coming from practice, sir. I'm an athlete, and I was heading home." She kept her voice respectful, even as frustration built inside her. The light had been yellow, and she'd been well within the intersection when it changed. Officer Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "An athlete? Well, that doesn't give you the right to disregard traffic signals." He seemed to dismiss her explanation entirely, already pulling out his ticket book. Sarah tried once more to explain. "Sir, I understand safety is important, but I was already in the intersection when the light changed. I couldn't have stopped safely." "Ma'am, if you'd like to dispute the ticket, you can do so in court." His pen scratched across the paper as he wrote the citation. "But from where I was standing, you clearly violated traffic laws." A few cars drove past slowly, their occupants watching the scene with varying degrees of interest. Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm, but she held her composure. Her coach's words echoed in her head. "Control what you can control." When Officer Peterson handed her the ticket, Sarah accepted it without argument. The fine was $250, a significant amount that would cut into her training budget. She looked at the court date, 2 weeks from now, right before her important competition. "Drive safely," Officer Peterson said, already turning away, "and next time, stop when you see yellow." Sarah waited until the patrol car pulled away before letting out a long breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the ticket in her glove compartment. The drive home felt longer than usual, her earlier good mood completely evaporated. In her small apartment, Sarah placed her gym bag by the door and sank onto her couch. The ticket seemed to burn a hole in her thoughts. She could just pay it and move on. That would be the easiest choice. But something about the interaction, the dismissive tone, the assumption of guilt, felt wrong. She picked up her phone and dialed her mother's number. If anyone could help her think through this clearly, it would be her mom. As the phone rang, Sarah glanced at the collection of medals hanging on her wall. She had fought hard for everything she'd achieved in life. Maybe this was another fight worth taking on. "Hi, Mom," she said when the line connected. "You won't believe what just happened." Sarah's mother listened quietly on the phone as her daughter explained about the traffic ticket. After a long pause, she spoke with the wisdom that came from years of navigating similar situations. "Baby, sometimes you have to pick your battles. Is this one worth fighting?" The question stayed with Sarah as she went through her morning routine the next day. She arrived at the training center earlier than usual, hoping to discuss the situation with her coach, James Miller, before the other athletes arrived. Coach Miller was already there, setting up hurdles on the indoor track. At 65, with gray hair and kind eyes, He had been more than just a coach to Sarah for the past 10 years. He was like a second father, guiding her from a talented teenager to an Olympic champion. "Coach, I need your advice," Sarah said, showing him the ticket. She explained everything that had happened the previous evening: the unfair stop, the officer's attitude, and her growing anger about the situation. Coach Miller removed his baseball cap and wiped his forehead. "Sarah, you've got the World Championships in 3 weeks. This is the worst possible timing for a court battle." He gestured toward the track. "Every minute counts in your preparation." "I know," Sarah replied, stretching her legs. "But something doesn't feel right about just paying the fine and moving on." The other athletes began arriving, and Sarah started her warm-up routine. As she ran her first lap, her mind wandered to the competition ahead. She had won 3 Olympic medals, but the World Championships were special. Only one gold medal had escaped her so far: the 400-meter hurdles. This year was supposed to be different. During water breaks, Sarah checked her phone. Her mother had sent links to news articles about bias and traffic stops. Her best friend had texted suggesting she just pay the ticket and focus on training. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. The pressure built as the days passed. Sarah's training times weren't improving as they should. Coach Miller noticed her distraction during practice. After she knocked over 3 hurdles in one session, he called her aside. "You're not focused," he said directly. "This ticket business is getting in your head." Sarah wiped sweat from her face with a towel. "I keep thinking about that officer's attitude, how he didn't even listen to me. If I don't stand up for myself, who will?" Coach Miller sat beside her on the bench. "Look, I understand this is about more than just a traffic ticket, but you've worked 4 years for this competition. Sometimes being a champion means knowing which race to run." That evening, Sarah spread her training schedule, the court summons, and her competition calendar across her kitchen table. The court date was exactly 2 weeks before the World Championships. If things went badly, it could disrupt her final preparation phase. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister. "Saw this on Instagram. Thought of you." The link led to a video of a young black woman giving a speech about standing up to injustice. "The right time to do the right thing is always right now," the woman said. Sarah walked to her bedroom and looked at her medals displayed on the wall. Each one represented not just athletic achievement, but years of dedication, sacrifice, and perseverance. She had never taken the easy path when she knew the harder one was right. Making her decision, Sarah picked up her phone and called her mother again. "Mom, I'm going to court," she said firmly. "I'll need a suit to wear." Her mother's smile was audible in her voice. "I was hoping you'd say that. Your father and I raised you to stand up for what's right." That night, Sarah slept better than she had since getting the ticket. The next morning, she arrived at practice with renewed energy. When Coach Miller saw her improved times, he shook his head with a knowing smile. "Made your decision, didn't you?" he asked. Sarah nodded, adjusting her starting blocks. "Yes, sir. Some races aren't run on the track." The morning of her court date arrived with gray skies and light rain. Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue suit her mother had helped her choose. It felt strange to wear formal clothes instead of her usual training gear, but she wanted to make a good impression. The courthouse was an old building in downtown Atlanta, with high ceilings and marble floors that made every footstep echo. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early, following her mother's advice. She sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 3, watching people hurry past with worried faces. A young man in a similar situation sat down beside her. "Traffic ticket?" he asked nervously. Sarah nodded. "Yellow light violation." "Just pay the fine," he suggested, checking his watch. "Judge Harrison is tough. He hardly ever listens to explanations." Before Sarah could respond, the courtroom doors opened. People filed in quietly, like students entering an exam hall. Sarah chose a seat in the middle row, placing her small handbag beside her. The room smelled of old wood and paper. At exactly 9:00 a.m., a court officer stood up. "All rise," he called out. "The Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding." Judge Harrison entered the room. He was tall and thin, with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His black robe seemed too big for his frame, but his stern expression made up for it. He sat down and began shuffling through papers without looking at anyone. "Be seated," he said in a bored voice. "Let's get through today's cases quickly." Sarah watched as case after case was called. Most people simply agreed to pay their fines. The few who tried to explain their situations were cut off quickly by the judge. Sarah felt her confidence wavering, but she remembered her mother's words. Stand tall and speak your truth. After what seemed like hours, the court officer called out, Case number 247, Sarah Johnson. Sarah stood up, smoothing her suit jacket. She walked to the podium, her heels clicking against the floor. Judge Harrison didn't look up from his papers. Ms. Johnson, you're contesting a yellow light violation. Officer Peterson's report states you deliberately ran a changing light at the intersection of Peachtree and Pine. Judge Harrison's voice was flat, uninterested. Do you have any evidence to contradict the officer's statement? Sarah stood straight, just like she did before a race. Yes, Your Honor, I was already in the intersection when the light changed. Stopping suddenly would have been dangerous. Judge Harrison finally looked up, but only to frown at her. Everyone says that, Ms. Johnson. Do you have any actual evidence? I understand how it looks, Your Honor, Sarah continued calmly, but I'm a professional athlete. I'm trained to be precise and aware of my surroundings. I wouldn't risk my safety or anyone else's by running a light. The judge's frown deepened. Being an athlete doesn't put you above the law, Ms. Johnson. The fine is $250, plus $50 in court costs. Pay at the window outside. Sarah felt her heart racing, but she kept her voice steady. Your Honor, may I please explain something? Ms. Johnson, I have a full docket today, Judge Harrison said sharply. Unless you have evidence to present. At that moment, the young court clerk who had been typing nearby looked up suddenly. His eyes widened as he stared at Sarah. He quickly stood up and walked to the judge's bench, whispering something in Judge Harrison's ear. The judge's expression changed slightly. He looked at Sarah again, this time more carefully. Ms. Johnson, he said slowly, the clerk tells me you're an Olympic athlete? Sarah nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I've represented our country in the last 2 Olympics. I was returning from training when this happened. The courtroom, which had been filled with whispers and shuffling papers, grew completely quiet. Even the court officer seemed to stand a little straighter. Judge Harrison took off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth, taking his time. When he put them back on, his face had lost some of its sternness. Perhaps, he said, clearing his throat, we should review this case more thoroughly. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted like a sudden change in weather. Judge Harrison shuffled through his papers again, but this time with more purpose. The other people waiting for their cases watched with growing interest, wondering what had caused the judge's change in attitude. Ms. Johnson, Judge Harrison said, his voice now carrying a hint of respect that wasn't there before. You mentioned you were returning from training. Could you elaborate on that? Sarah stood firmly at the podium, her hands clasped in front of her. Yes, Your Honor, I trained twice daily at the Olympic Training Center. That evening, I had just finished a 12-hour training session. The young clerk who had recognized her was now frantically writing notes and passing them to the judge. Judge Harrison glanced at each note, his frown growing deeper with every piece of paper he read. I see here, he said slowly, that you won gold medals in the 400-meter hurdles and relay events. Quite impressive. He paused, looking uncomfortable. However, Ms. Johnson, success in sports doesn't excuse traffic violations. Sarah noticed how he called her Ms. Johnson now, instead of dismissively cutting her off like he had done with others. The change bothered her more than his earlier rudeness. Your Honor, Sarah said clearly, I'm not asking for special treatment because of my medals. I'm asking for fairness. The light was yellow when I entered the intersection. I made a split-second decision based on safety, just as I've been trained to do. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his desk. The courtroom remained silent, waiting. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. The fine stands at $300 total, he announced finally. However, given your status in the community, I'm willing to reduce it to $150. Sarah felt her face grow warm. This wasn't what she wanted at all. She looked around the courtroom at the other people waiting for their cases to be called. Many of them looked defeated, knowing they wouldn't receive the same offer. Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice stronger now. I respectfully decline the reduced fine. Judge Harrison's eyebrows shot up. The clerk stopped typing, his fingers frozen over the keyboard. Even the court officer turned to look at Sarah. You decline? Judge Harrison asked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Yes, sir, Sarah replied. Either I committed a violation and should pay the full fine, or I didn't and should pay nothing. I don't want special treatment because of my medals. The judge's face reddened slightly. He wasn't used to people refusing his generous offers. Ms. Johnson, perhaps you don't understand. I'm trying to be lenient here. I understand completely, Your Honor, Sarah said quietly. What about the person who was here before me? Or the one who will come after? Don't they deserve the same consideration? The courtroom remained silent, but Sarah could feel the energy change. Some people sat straighter in their seats. Others nodded slightly. The young man who had advised her to just pay the fine was staring at her with wide eyes. Judge Harrison's face went through several expressions: surprise, irritation, and finally, something that looked like shame. He shuffled his papers again, but this time it seemed more like a nervous habit than a purposeful action. Well, he said finally, his voice stiff, if you insist on the full fine. What I insist on, Your Honor, Sarah interrupted carefully, is a fair review of what happened. Just like you would give anyone else. No more, no less. The judge stared at her for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, he picked up his gavel. Very well, Ms. Johnson, he said slowly. Given your insistence on a full review, I'm going to need to see the officer's dash cam footage. Court will recess for 15 minutes while we retrieve it. The gavel banged, echoing through the quiet courtroom. As Judge Harrison stood up to leave, Sarah noticed his hands were shaking slightly. She sat down in her chair, her heart pounding but her head held high. The real battle, she realized, was just beginning. When court resumed 15 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely changed. News of Sarah's identity had spread quickly through the courthouse. The previously half-empty benches were now filled with curious onlookers, including several court staff who had no real reason to be there. Officer Peterson had arrived during the break, looking nervous as he sat in the front row. He kept adjusting his collar and glancing at Sarah, clearly recognizing her now. The young clerk had brought in a TV screen to show the dashcam footage. Judge Harrison returned to his seat, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced by careful formality. Officer Peterson, please approach the bench, he called out. The officer walked forward stiffly. Sarah noticed he wasn't making eye contact with anyone. She remembered how confidently he had approached her car that night, and the difference was striking. Your Honor, Officer Peterson began, I want to clarify some points about my report. We'll get to that. Judge Harrison interrupted. First, let's watch the dashcam footage. The video started playing on the screen. The evening traffic was clearly visible, and Sarah's Honda Civic moved through the intersection just as the light changed from green to yellow. The timing was obvious. She had been well into the intersection before the yellow light appeared. The courtroom stayed quiet as the footage played. When it ended, Judge Harrison took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Officer Peterson, would you care to explain why you wrote in your report that Ms. Johnson ran a yellow light? Officer Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, from my angle, it appeared. The angle shown in your own dash cam? The judge asked sharply. While this exchange happened, Sarah sat quietly, watching as other details about her emerged in the courtroom. The clerk had been busy. He handed the judge more papers. Ms. Johnson, Judge Harrison said, turning to her, I see here that beyond your Olympic achievements, you run a youth sports program in underprivileged neighborhoods. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied. 3 times a week, I train young athletes who can't afford regular coaching. More whispers spread through the courtroom. Officer Peterson looked even more uncomfortable. And on the evening in question, the judge continued, reading from another paper, you were returning from one of these training sessions. Yes, sir. We had a special evening session because many of the kids' parents worked during the day. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, then turned back to Officer Peterson. Officer, how many traffic stops have you made at that intersection this month? I'm not sure of the exact number, Your Honor. 27, the judge said firmly. According to your reports, 15 of those stopped were African American drivers, in an area where they make up less than 30% of the population. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. Would you care to explain that? The officer's face had gone pale. Sir, I was just doing my job, following procedure. Sarah watched as understanding spread across faces in the courtroom. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It never had been. Judge Harrison turned to Sarah again, but this time his face showed genuine respect. Ms. Johnson, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, in fact. He straightened the papers on his desk, taking a deep breath before continuing. First, for not reviewing your case properly. Second, for attempting to offer you preferential treatment based on your status. And third, for not seeing the bigger picture here until you forced me to look at it. The courtroom was completely silent now. Everyone watched as the judge picked up his gavel. Case dismissed, he announced firmly. Furthermore, I am ordering a full review of traffic stops at that intersection for the past 6 months. The gavel banged, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Ms. Johnson, would you be willing to stay after court? There are some community programs I'd like to discuss with you. It seems we could benefit from your insight. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into something much more significant. She looked around the courtroom, at the faces showing everything from shame to admiration, and knew that real change often started in unexpected ways. After the court session ended, Judge Harrison invited Sarah to his chambers. The room was smaller than she expected, with walls covered in law books and framed certificates. A small window let in afternoon sunlight that made dust particles dance in the air. The judge had removed his black robe and looked more human now in his regular suit. He gestured for Sarah to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. The young clerk who had recognized her brought in 3 cups of coffee, his hands still shaking slightly with excitement. Ms. Johnson, Judge Harrison began, his voice different from the one he used in court. I've been a judge for 25 years. I thought I had seen everything. He paused, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. But today, you taught me something important. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, waiting for him to continue. Outside the office, they could hear people walking through the courthouse halls, their voices a distant murmur. I looked up more about your work while we waited for the dashcam footage, the judge continued. You don't just train Olympic athletes. You work with kids from the poorest neighborhoods in Atlanta, kids who might otherwise be getting into trouble. Everyone needs a chance, Your Honor, Sarah replied simply. Sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you. The young clerk, who had been standing quietly by the door, spoke up. My little sister is in your youth program, Ms. Johnson. She talks about you all the time, says she wants to be just like you when she grows up. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. Is that how you recognized her, Michael? Yes, sir, the clerk replied. My sister has your poster on her wall, Ms. Johnson. She was in trouble at school last year, but since joining your program, her grades have improved. Mom says it's like having a different child. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. This was why she did what she did. Not for the medals, but for moments like this. That's exactly what I want to talk about, Judge Harrison said, leaning forward in his chair. We have a youth intervention program here at the courthouse. It's supposed to help kids who get into minor trouble find better paths, but it's not working as well as it should. He stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city below. Most of these kids don't trust the system, and after what I saw today in court, I understand why. We need to bridge that gap. Sarah set down her coffee cup. What are you suggesting, Your Honor? The judge turned back to face her. I'd like you to help us redesign the program. Your experience with youth sports, your understanding of discipline and dedication, and most importantly, your perspective on fairness. We need all of that. It's a big ask, he continued quickly. You're training for the World Championships, and I know your time is valuable. But think of the impact we could have. Sports programs, mentoring, maybe even internships at the courthouse. Sarah thought about all the young faces she saw at her training sessions. Kids who came from neighborhoods where dreams often died young. Kids who needed to see that the system could work for them, not just against them. I'll do it, she said firmly. But I have one condition. Name it, the judge replied. Officer Peterson joins the program too. Sarah held up her hand as both men started to protest. Not as punishment, but as part of the solution. He needs to see these kids as people, not statistics, and they need to see him as someone who can help, not hurt. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. You know, Ms. Johnson, when you first walked into my courtroom this morning, I saw you as just another case number. I was wrong about that, just like Officer Peterson was wrong about you that night. He extended his hand across the desk. We have a deal. When can you start? As Sarah shook his hand, she felt like she was starting a new race. Not one that would win her medals, but one that might change lives, including her own. 1 week after the court hearing, Sarah sat in her living room surrounded by papers and notebooks. The World Championships were still her main focus, but she had already started working on ideas for the Courthouse Youth Program. Her coffee table was covered with training schedules, program outlines, and newspaper articles about her court case. The story had spread quickly through Atlanta. Local news stations had picked it up, and social media was buzzing with discussions about bias in traffic stops. Sarah's phone kept lighting up with messages from friends, fellow athletes, and people she had never met. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Officer Peterson, right on time for their scheduled meeting. Sarah had invited him over to discuss his role in the youth program. He stood awkwardly in her doorway, wearing casual clothes instead of his uniform. Come in, Sarah said, gesturing to a chair. Would you like some water? Officer Peterson sat down stiffly. Yes, please. His eyes wandered to her wall of medals, then quickly looked away. Ms. Johnson, I want to apologize again for what happened. Sarah returned with 2 glasses of water. I didn't invite you here for more apologies, she said firmly. I invited you because we need to talk about how to make things better. She picked up one of her notebooks and opened it. I've been thinking about your part in the program. You have skills these kids could use. Knowledge about law enforcement, safety, and community relations. Officer Peterson looked surprised. You really think they'll want to learn anything from me? After what happened? That's exactly why it needs to be you, Sarah explained. You made a mistake. Now you're working to fix it. That's a powerful lesson for young people. She showed him some of her plans. The program would combine sports training with education about law, citizenship, and community service. Police officers would work alongside athletes and judges, breaking down barriers that had existed for generations. It won't be easy, Sarah admitted. Some of these kids have had bad experiences with police. Their parents have had bad experiences. That trust has to be rebuilt. Officer Peterson nodded slowly, like how I judged you that night, without really seeing you. Exactly, Sarah said. But you're here now, wanting to change. That's what matters. They spent the next hour discussing ideas. Officer Peterson suggested adding sessions about traffic laws and citizen rights. Sarah talked about using sports to teach discipline and respect. Together, they started creating something new. As they worked, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Judge Harrison. He had secured funding for the program and wanted to meet tomorrow to discuss details. The wheels of change were turning faster than she had expected. Later that evening, after Officer Peterson left, Sarah went for a run in her neighborhood. The same streets where she had been stopped now felt different. Children playing basketball waved as she passed. A police car drove by, and the officer inside gave her a respectful nod. At home, she found an email from her coach. Saw this and thought of you, he wrote. Attached was a photo from that morning's training session. A young black girl was wearing a t-shirt with Sarah's Olympic photo on it. The girl was practicing hurdles, her face set with determination. Sarah smiled at the photo, then looked at her World Championship training schedule. The competition was important, but now it felt like part of something bigger. Each medal she won wasn't just for her anymore. It was for every kid who needed to see that barriers could be broken. She picked up her notebook again and wrote at the top of a fresh page, Goals for Youth Program. Below it, she started listing ideas. Break down stereotypes. Build trust. Create understanding. Show paths to success. Turn negative experiences into positive change. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. Proud of you, baby, the message read. You're not just winning races anymore. You're changing the game. Sarah looked out her window at the darkening sky. Tomorrow she would train for the World Championships. Tomorrow she would work on the youth program. Tomorrow she would continue the work of making change. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel the weight and wonder of how a simple traffic stop had turned into something so much more. 3 months had passed since the court hearing that changed everything. On a bright Saturday morning, Sarah stood at the entrance of the newly renovated community center near the courthouse. A large banner hung above the door. Champions of Change Youth Program. Grand opening. Judge Harrison stood beside her, looking different in casual clothes instead of his court robe. Officer Peterson was there too, helping young volunteers set up chairs in the main hall. The transformation in him was remarkable. He now smiled easily and talked comfortably with everyone. "Ready for this?" Judge Harrison asked, watching as families began arriving. Sarah nodded, touching the gold medal hanging around her neck. She had won it at the World Championships just 2 weeks ago, finally claiming the one title that had escaped her. But today's event felt just as important as that victory. The community center's main hall filled quickly. Sarah saw faces she recognized from her training programs, along with new ones. Parents sat with their children, some looking nervous, others excited. Police officers in casual clothes mingled with the crowd, playing basketball with kids in the corner. At exactly 10:00 a.m., Sarah stepped up to the microphone. The room fell quiet. 3 months ago, she began, I got a traffic ticket. Soft laughter spread through the crowd. That ticket led to a court hearing, which led to a conversation, which led to all of us being here today. She gestured to Judge Harrison and Officer Peterson. These men taught me something important. Change doesn't just happen in big moments. It happens in small ones, when people are willing to admit their mistakes and work to fix them. The judge stood up next to her. Ms. Johnson taught me something too, he added. Justice isn't just about following rules. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and giving everyone a fair chance. Officer Peterson joined them, holding a stack of papers. We're starting something new here, he said. A program where kids can learn about sports, law, and community. Where they can see police officers as helpers, not threats. Where judges come down from their benches to mentor young people. Sarah watched as Michael, the court clerk, wheeled in a TV screen. On it played a video of her winning race from the World Championships. But next to that footage was something else. Pictures from the past 3 months. The planning meetings, the trial runs of the program. Officer Peterson teaching traffic safety to smiling kids. Judge Harrison helping young people understand their rights. This program isn't just about sports, Sarah continued. It's about breaking down walls. It's about turning difficult moments into opportunities for change. She pointed to the back of the room, where several teenagers wore T-shirts with Youth Leader printed on them. These young people will help run our programs. Some of them have had trouble with the law before. Now they're helping others stay on the right path. One of those teenagers was Michael's sister, standing tall in her Youth Leader shirt. Her transformation from a troubled student to a program leader was just one of their early successes. We've already seen changes, Judge Harrison added. Traffic stop complaints are down. Youth court appearances have decreased. And most importantly, trust is growing. Sarah held up her World Championship gold medal. This medal means a lot to me, she said. But what means more is seeing change happen right here in our community. Every person in this room is a champion of change. She looked at the eager faces in front of her. So who's ready to get started? The room erupted in cheers and applause. As people broke into groups for the first day's activities, Sarah watched Officer Peterson teaching a young boy proper sprinting form. Nearby, Judge Harrison sat cross-legged on the floor, playing chess with a teenage girl who used to appear in his courtroom. Sarah's mother, watching from the side, wiped tears from her eyes. "Look what you started, baby," she whispered when Sarah walked over. Sarah smiled, watching the room full of people learning to see each other in new ways. A traffic stop had brought her here, but it was the courage to challenge unfairness, the willingness to help others change, and the determination to make things better that would keep the program going. As she joined a group of young athletes for their first training session, Sarah knew that some victories weren't marked by medals. They were marked by moments like this, moments of transformation, understanding, and hope.